That day was anything but ordinary. The sun rose on schedule, punctual as always, casting its golden rays across the dusty streets of Ouagadougou. The morning air carried its usual gentle chill, that familiar coolness that settles over the Sahel before the heat of day begins its inevitable climb. But despite these mundane constants, an unmistakable tension hung over the entire city like a shroud. There was something different in the atmosphere, something electric, something foreboding. It was as if the very wind itself was holding back words it dared not speak. As if the hands of time were moving deliberately, inexorably toward a moment that would define not just a day, but an era. The streets of Ouagadougou bustled with their usual morning rush. Vendors setting up their stalls, motorcycles weaving through traffic, the cacophony of a city awakening to another day of survival and struggle. But on every face, in every hurried glance, there lingered the same unspoken question. Would Captain Ibrahim Traoré really be arrested today? The rumors had been swirling for weeks. Whispers in cafes, heated debates in university classrooms, anxious conversations in family compounds. Some said the charges were fabricated, a transparent attempt by those in power to silence a voice that had grown too loud, too bold. Others believed the law must take its course, regardless of politics or popularity. But everyone, from the street sweeper to the university professor, knew that today would be pivotal. Captain Ibrahim Traoré was not just another military officer. He had become something more, a symbol, an idea, a living embodiment of the frustrations and aspirations of millions across Burkina Faso and beyond. His journey from a simple soldier to a figure of national prominence had been marked by unwavering principles and fearless advocacy for the common people. He had dared to question the old order, to challenge foreign interference, to speak truth that made the powerful uncomfortable. And now, those same powerful forces had decided it was time to make him pay for his audacity. The scene outside the High Court building told its own story, one of anticipation, anxiety, and unprecedented security. Armed personnel lined every entrance, their faces stern and professional, their weapons held ready. Every person attempting to enter the court premises was subjected to thorough searches. Journalists, particularly, found themselves scrutinized with special intensity. Their identification cards were checked, double-checked, and checked again. Some were questioned about their affiliations, their previous reporting, their intentions for the day. Outside the main gates, a massive crowd had gathered. It seemed as though half the city had come to witness history in the making. Some people had climbed onto nearby rooftops, straining to catch a glimpse of the court entrance. Others pressed against the barriers, mobile phones held high, live streaming the scene to thousands of viewers across the country and continent. The air hummed with nervous energy. Every person there was waiting for the same moment, the arrival of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Inside the courtroom, preparations had been meticulous. Every seat was occupied, every vantage point claimed. The atmosphere was thick with a profound seriousness that seemed almost tangible. Most faces bore expressions of quiet intensity, some anxious, some curious, some deliberately neutral. Only the soft murmur of whispered conversations disturbed the silence, words bouncing off the high ceilings and paneled walls before fading into nothingness. The security personnel stationed along the walls stood rigidly at attention, their posture suggesting that they, too, understood the gravity of the moment. They were not merely guards, but witnesses to history. Today, Captain Traoré was scheduled to appear before the court to answer serious charges: unconstitutional actions, abuse of authority, and endangering national security. These accusations, while cloaked in legal terminology, were transparent to anyone paying attention. This was not about justice. It was about revenge. Those who followed the political landscape closely understood the true nature of this prosecution. It was the culmination of months of mounting tension between Traoré and the entrenched establishment. He had challenged the roots of the old system, exposed foreign meddling in national affairs, and given voice to the grievances of ordinary people who had long felt powerless. These acts of defiance had made him dangerous in the eyes of those who ruled from behind closed doors. in the corridors of power, where rulers play their games of influence and control. A decision had been made. Ibrahim Traoré must be silenced. The plan was straightforward and they believed foolproof. He would be humiliated in court, presented to the public as a criminal, arrested before the cameras, and all of it wrapped in the veneer of legal procedure. The judge had already been approached. Some sources claimed he'd been offered millions of francs, guarantees of protection, and property abroad. All he had to do was ensure that Ibrahim Traoré left the court in handcuffs, but those who crafted this plan had forgotten something crucial. This was Africa, and here not every man has a price. Not every soul can be bought, and not every spirit can be broken. The courtroom clock ticked steadily toward the appointed hour. The judge's chair remained conspicuously empty, adding to the mounting tension. Every eye in the room periodically shifted toward the main entrance, as if collective will alone could hasten the proceedings. Journalists checked their equipment one final time. Cameras were positioned, recording devices activated, notebooks opened to fresh pages. Then a subtle movement near the door. The shift in attention was instantaneous and total. Hundreds of eyes turned as one toward the entrance. Camera operators adjusted their angles, fingers hovering over record buttons. Some spectators half rose from their seats, unable to contain their anticipation. Outside, the crowd sensed the approaching moment, and a wave of heightened alertness rippled through the masses. This was it. The moment when an ordinary man's footsteps would cross the threshold into history. A simple black vehicle, devoid of flags or official insignia, approached the court gates slowly, deliberately. There was no convoy, no security detail, no sirens or fanfare. Just one car, moving with quiet determination through the parted crowds. The contrast with typical displays of official power could not have been more stark. This was not how the mighty arrived, and perhaps that was precisely the point. The vehicle came to a gentle stop. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the door opened and Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped out. He wore his khaki military uniform, not the decorated version reserved for ceremonies, but the simple, practical uniform of a soldier who had served in the field. There were no medals on his shoulders, no insignia of rank displayed prominently on his chest. Just the plain uniform that had seen real service, real sacrifice, real commitment to his country and people. His bearing was calm, almost serene. His face showed no sign of fear or defiance, only a quiet confidence. His eyes held that particular clarity that comes only to those who know they speak the truth, who carry no burden of deception or doubt. As he stood outside the vehicle, surveying the scene before him, there was about him an aura of unshakable resolve. The guards at the door watched his approach. Without any verbal command or gesture, they stepped aside, creating a clear path. This simple act, this wordless acknowledgement, spoke volumes. These men, trained to follow orders without question, were offering something beyond duty: respect. Their silence was a salute more meaningful than any formal gesture. Cameras erupted into action, flashes lighting up the morning like lightning strikes. Journalists held their breath, pens frozen above notebooks, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment they were witnessing. Inside the court, the murmur of conversation ceased entirely as word spread. He had arrived. People made way for him instinctively. Not a word was spoken, no chants or slogans, no applause or cheers. Just silence. But within that silence lived a powerful message, one that needed no voice. We are with you. Traoré began ascending the courthouse steps slowly, each footfall deliberate and measured. The sound of his boots on stone echoed in the morning air, a rhythmic reminder of progress, of advancement, of forward movement that nothing could stop. These steps, which had witnessed countless trials over the decades, were now bearing witness to a historic moment. The heavy doors of the courthouse swung open, and Captain Ibrahim Traoré entered. The atmosphere inside the courtroom transformed the instant he crossed the threshold. Every person seated in that chamber felt it, a shift in the very air, as if the room itself recognized the significance of this presence. All eyes fixed upon him, studying his every move, reading his expression, searching for signs of fear or arrogance, weakness or aggression. He was alone. No security detail flanked him. No lawyer walked beside him. No political allies stood in solidarity. He had come without entourage or support staff, without the trappings of power or influence. Yet in his solitude, there was strength. He carried with him his integrity, his truth, and behind him, though invisible, stood the hopes of an entire nation. Some spectators moved involuntarily, as if to stand in respect, the way one might rise for an honored guest. But they caught themselves quickly settling back into their seats. The atmosphere was charged with intensity, almost suffocating in its seriousness. This was not merely a court proceeding. It was a confrontation between power and principle, between manufactured accusations and genuine righteousness. Traoré moved without hesitation toward his designated seat on the right side of the chamber. No one called his name or directed him. He seemed to know instinctively where to position himself. As he sat down, that space somehow became sacred, transformed by his presence into something more than just another courtroom bench. On the wall facing the gallery, the national emblem of Burkina Faso gleamed under the artificial lights. Below it, the words, "Justice for all," were inscribed in bold letters. Today, those words faced their greatest test. Would they prove to be mere decoration, empty rhetoric painted on a wall? Or would they, against all odds, manifest as living reality? The judge had not yet entered. The courtroom held its collective breath, everyone aware that what would unfold in the coming hours would determine far more than one man's fate. This was a moment that would define the direction of an entire country. Among those seated in the courtroom were political operatives from various factions, government officials with carefully neutral expressions, and international observers whose presence added another layer of complexity to the proceedings. Some of these foreign representatives sat with notebooks open, recording everything with meticulous attention. They had come expecting a particular script to unfold. The script they had helped to write. They did not yet realize that history was about to improvise. Everyone in that room carried the same unspoken question in their minds. Would Traoré break? Would he apologize, show remorse, plead for mercy? Or would he do what the world had come to expect from him, stand firm, uncompromising, unbowed? Traoré closed his eyes for a moment, taking a slow, deliberate breath. When he opened them again, his gaze was direct, looking straight ahead. He did not avert his eyes from anyone, but neither did he seek confrontation through aggressive staring. His hands rested calmly in his lap, fingers loosely interlaced. Everything about his posture conveyed tranquility and self-assurance. This was a soldier's arrival. No fear, no pretense, no falsehood. Just the armor of truth and the weapon of dignity. A bell rang, signaling the formal commencement of proceedings. The judge still had not appeared, but court officials were taking their positions, organizing documents, preparing for the ritual of law to begin. The silence in the gallery was absolute now, though beneath that silence, storms raged in countless hearts. Every eye remained fixed on the solitary figure seated calmly in his plain uniform, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. A figure rose from the prosecution bench. He was the government's attorney, a man whose reputation had been built on winning difficult cases through a combination of legal acumen and political maneuvering. His arms were laden with folders and files, the accumulated paperwork of accusation and alleged evidence. He cleared his throat softly, adjusted his glasses with practiced precision, and began to speak in a voice carefully, calibrated to convey both authority and gravity. The State of Burkina Faso versus Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The words reverberated through the courtroom like a declaration of war. This was no longer abstract speculation or rumor. The machinery of prosecution was now in motion, grinding forward with bureaucratic inevitability. The prosecutor opened his files with theatrical deliberation, extracting documents and arranging them on the podium before him. His voice, though professionally modulated, carried an undertone of something darker, perhaps anticipation, perhaps satisfaction at the thought of a challenging adversary finally brought to heel. "The charges before this honorable court are as follows," he intoned, his words clipped and formal. First, violation of Article 35 of the Constitution of Burkina Faso. Second, interference in governmental systems without authorization and the issuance of illegal orders. Third, leading activities that endanger state security. Fourth, delivering inflammatory speeches against government officials. And fifth, damaging the diplomatic relations of the state through criticism of foreign assistance and interference. The language was the sanitized vocabulary of legal proceedings, but everyone present understood the translation. You asked questions. Now you will be silenced. As the prosecutor's voice droned through the litany of accusations, each charge more severe than the last, Traoré's expression remained unchanged. His face might have been carved from stone. No furrowed brow betrayed concern, no nervous tic revealed anxiety. He gave every impression of a man who had anticipated precisely this moment, who had prepared himself mentally and emotionally for exactly these accusations. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, not on the prosecutor but on something beyond, perhaps on the corrupt system itself, the machinery of power that now sought to crush him beneath its wheels. The journalists in attendance scribbled furiously in their notebooks, their pens racing to capture every word. Some had their recording devices running, preserving every syllable for posterity. But most kept stealing glances at Traoré's face, because they understood instinctively that the real story was not in the prosecutor's words, but in the captain's response, or his remarkable lack thereof. The true narrative was written not in legal terminology but in human expression, in the battle between external pressure and internal strength. As the prosecutor concluded his presentation of charges, a subtle movement occurred near the main courtroom entrance. Two men in plain clothes rose slowly from their seats. They moved without obvious haste, but their body language conveyed purposefulness. Their hands drifted toward their belts, where handcuffs waited in leather pouches. One glanced at the other, a brief exchange of looks that confirmed their shared understanding. Then, in unison, they began moving forward through the gallery. Their target was unmistakable, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The courtroom atmosphere froze solid in an instant. Time itself seemed to crystallize, each second stretching impossibly long. A woman in the back row gasped softly, "Oh, God!" A journalist's pen slipped from nervous fingers and clattered to the floor. Another reporter's hand shot to his phone, pressing the record button with trembling urgency. Every eye tracked the two officers as they advanced, and every breath in that chamber seemed suspended in dread anticipation. Traoré made no movement. He did not turn his head to watch their approach, did not acknowledge their presence in any way. He simply remained as he was, straight-backed, calm, silent. His stillness seemed to communicate a message. "I know why you're coming. I will not fear you." But then, just as every observer had resigned themselves to witnessing an arrest, something extraordinary occurred. From the back of the chamber, a voice rang out with commanding authority. "Stop! That single word, delivered with such force and conviction, stopped the two officers in their tracks as effectively as a physical barrier. A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom. People who had been leaning forward in anxious anticipation now sat rigidly upright. The officers froze mid-step, as if struck by an invisible command more powerful than their training or orders. All eyes swiveled toward the source of that voice. Judge Syed Usman Kabiori was entering the courtroom. He was not just any judge. Syed Usman Kabiori had spent decades building a reputation that commanded respect throughout Burkina Faso's legal community. His name was synonymous with fairness, integrity, and an uncompromising dedication to the principles of law over political expediency. He wore the traditional black robe of his office but carried no files in his hands. What he bore instead was written on his face, a determination that transcended any document, a resolve more powerful than any legal brief. Each step he took was measured and deliberate, yet the sound of his footfalls seemed to echo through the chamber with unusual resonance. His eyes were locked on the two plainclothes officers who had been advancing toward Traoré, and in those eyes burned something fierce and unwavering. As he mounted the steps to the judge's bench, He raised one hand in a gesture that demanded absolute attention. Then, in a voice that carried the weight of decades of jurisprudence and the thunder of righteous indignation, he spoke. "This is a court of law, not a battlefield." The word struck like a hammer blow. The entire chamber seemed to hold its collective breath. Every person present, every official, every soldier, every journalist, every diplomat, was suddenly utterly still. The two officers who had been moving toward Traoré found their feet rooted to the spot, their confidence evaporating, their eyes rising involuntarily to meet the judge's fierce gaze. Judge Traoré settled into his chair with the gravity of a man about to deliver judgment not just on a case, but on the soul of a nation. He drew a deep breath, then spoke again, his voice now controlled but no less powerful. "Has the law of Burkina Faso become so weak that this court is to be used as a pawn in political games?" Silence. Profound, heavy silence. But this was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of respect, even reverence. People recognized that they were witnessing something rare, the law asserting itself against raw power. The judge's eyes found the two officers again. "Who authorized you to make an arrest before these proceedings are complete? Does this court now operate according to your whims? You are here to serve the law, not to fulfill the wishes of ministers." Sweat appeared on the officers' foreheads. Their eyes dropped to the floor. The uniforms they wore, which moments ago had given them authority, now seemed to weigh upon them like chains. They had come prepared to execute orders without question, and suddenly found themselves called to account for those very orders. Judge Traoré paused, allowing his words to sink in. Then his gaze shifted to Traoré, taking in the captain's composed demeanor, his remarkable stillness in the face of attempted intimidation. The judge's expression softened almost imperceptibly, showing not sympathy, but recognition. An acknowledgement of dignity, meeting dignity. He turned back to address the entire courtroom, his voice rising with renewed force. "Captain Ibrahim Traoré is neither a convict nor a criminal at this moment. He is a guest of this court, appearing as a citizen to answer questions under law. Until such time as the law proves guilt beyond doubt, no one will lay hands upon him." These words were not merely for those present in the courtroom. They constituted a declaration to the entire nation. Justice still lives. The judge's attention returned to the two officers, and his voice took on an edge like steel. "Return to your seats. And remember this, you serve the gun as your tool, not as your master. When your loyalty deviates from the law, you cease to be officers of justice and become nothing more than hired enforcers." The two men retreated immediately, walking with obvious discomfort back to their original positions and sitting down heavily. Throughout the courtroom, it seemed as though everyone released a breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. Several spectators lowered their heads in silent thanksgiving. Journalists' pens resumed their movement across paper, recording this unexpected turn of events. Camera shutters clicked once more, capturing a moment that would be remembered for generations. Traoré remained seated in his quiet dignity, but those watching closely might have noticed a subtle change in his expression. Not triumph or vindication, but perhaps a glimmer of something more profound. It was the light of recognition that justice, though often absent, had not entirely disappeared from the world. That somewhere, in some hearts, the principle of law still held sway over the convenience of power. Judge Traoré rang his bell and announced that proceedings would continue. But everyone in that courtroom understood that the real proceeding, the one that mattered most, had already concluded. The law had spoken, and in speaking, had reminded a watching nation what it was supposed to represent. After Judge Traoré's powerful intervention, and as the courtroom settled into a tense but more hopeful atmosphere, Captain Traoré slowly rose to his feet. No one had called on him to speak, no order had been given, yet his standing seemed entirely natural, even inevitable. There was no hurry in his movement, no theatrical flourish, just the complete self-possession of a man who knew exactly why he was there and what he needed to say. His rising was itself a statement, a wordless testimony. Every eye in the chamber fixed upon him once more. The judge, the prosecutor, The security personnel, the journalists, even the international observers who had come expecting merely to witness a predetermined show trial, all now waited to hear what this solitary figure in a simple military uniform would say. When Traoré spoke, his voice was neither loud nor aggressive. He did not shout or pound the table before him. Instead, he spoke with a calm clarity that somehow made every word carry to the furthest corners of the courtroom. There was fire in his voice, yes, but it was the fire of truth, not rage. "I did not come here today to offer excuses or to beg for mercy," he began, and the courtroom's silence deepened further. "If such a thing were possible, I am not a criminal. But if speaking truth has become a crime in my country, then yes, I am guilty. If standing for the welfare of ordinary people against those who oppress them is rebellion, then yes, I am a rebel. And if our courts have become instruments used against truth rather than in its service, then the people must become their own advocates." His words struck the walls and returned, echoing through the chamber. Some eyes lowered in what might have been shame. Some remained fixed on him with expressions of barely contained emotion. A few faces showed the soft guilt of those who knew they had compromised their principles for security or advancement. Traoré did not clasp his hands in supplication. He simply raised his eyes and continued. "Are these the same courts that were established to protect the people? Or have they become merely playgrounds for the wealthy and the powerful? When a soldier who fought at the border, who went hungry so others might eat, who grew up in poverty and knows its sting, when such a man is labeled a criminal simply for asking questions, what has become of justice?" His gaze swept across the courtroom and settled momentarily on the two officers who had attempted to arrest him minutes earlier. Their faces were still downcast, and in their expressions lingered what appeared to be genuine shame. The shame of men who realize they have allowed themselves to become tools of injustice. Traoré's voice softened slightly, taking on a tone that was almost gentle. "I forgive you both. You were following orders. You did not write this script that has been prepared for me, but I will not play the role that has been written for me in someone else's drama." These words inscribed themselves on every heart in that courtroom. This was not mere defiance or clever rhetoric. It was something far rarer, genuine moral authority. Traoré was demonstrating that true power resides not in the ability to command others, but in the capacity to rise above the machinations of those who seek to diminish you. He turned then to face Judge Caballori directly. "Your Honor, today you have reminded us that a courtroom is not merely a place where laws are applied mechanically, but a place where conscience can still speak. You have proven that not every seat of authority is for sale, and that not every judge merely shuffles papers and follows political winds. Sometimes, you have shown us, a judge looks into eyes and sees truth." Judge Caballori listened to these words in silence, his face reflecting the gravity of the moment. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that room, that he had become more than an arbiter of a single case. He had become a witness to history, and his actions would be remembered and discussed long after the specific details of charges and countercharges had faded from memory. Captain Traoré took a deep breath, like a climber who has reached a summit after a long and arduous ascent. There was no arrogance in his bearing, no bitterness, only profound peace. He did not call for applause or make emotional appeals for public support. He simply took one step backward, not in retreat or fear, but in a gesture of respect for the court and the process. The courtroom remained silent. No one cheered or clapped, because the moment transcended such ordinary expressions of approval. Yet within that silence lived voices louder than any revolutionary chant. Every person present knew they had witnessed a battle fought and won without weapons, without violence, armed only with the invincible weapon of truth. Traoré cast one final glance around the courtroom, taking in the faces of those who had come to watch his humiliation and instead had witnessed his vindication. Then he turned and began walking toward the exit, moving with the same measured pace that had characterized his arrival. No one blocked his path. No one called out or attempted to delay him. Everyone understood instinctively that dignity was leaving the room, and the only appropriate response was to bow before it. The echo of Captain Traoré's departing footsteps seemed to linger in the air long after he had left the courtroom. The silence that followed his exit was pregnant with unspoken meaning, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of awe, of hearts too full for words. Thousands of people, both inside the courthouse and gathered outside, found themselves experiencing something they would struggle to describe later, the palpable sense that they had witnessed something that would be told and retold for generations. No one had shouted slogans. No one had raised fists or broken into celebration. The moment had been too significant, too sacred for such ordinary displays. The dignity that Traoré carried with him commanded a respectful silence far more powerful than any cheering crowd could have been. An elderly journalist, a man who had covered hundreds of trials throughout his long career, leaned toward his colleague and whispered hoarsely, "In all my years, I have never seen justice win without a verdict being read, without evidence being presented, solely on the strength of one man's character." That sentiment began to spread, moving outward from the courtroom like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. The message that had been delivered in that chamber, through Judge Kabiori's words and Traoré's dignified bearing, was already escaping the courthouse walls and beginning to float through the city's atmosphere, carried on whispered conversations and rapid text messages. Outside, the crowd that had been waiting for hours saw Traoré emerge from the building. They did not rush forward or press against him. Instead, they instinctively stepped back, creating a path. No one touched him or called out, but their eyes spoke volumes: respect, pride, admiration, and perhaps most importantly, hope. These were not the eyes of people who had watched a hero escape punishment. These were the eyes of people who had seen justice reassert itself against overwhelming odds. A small girl, no more than 7 or 8 years old, tugged at her mother's dress and asked in a voice filled with childish curiosity, "Mama, who is that man?" Her mother, eyes glistening with unshed tears, bent down and whispered, "That is someone who reminded us that bowing down is not in our nature, my child." Remember his face. At that precise moment, a photographer captured an image that would become iconic. Traoré walking out of the courthouse, his head held high, his face serene and composed, his hands clasped behind his back. Within hours, that photograph would spread across social media platforms throughout Africa and beyond. Beneath it, someone had written a caption that would be shared millions of times. A man walked alone, but millions followed in silence. The image transcended its origins as a simple photograph. It became a symbol, a rallying point, a reminder of what was possible when principle confronted power and refused to blink. The reverberations of what had occurred in the courtroom reached far beyond the masses of ordinary citizens. In the presidential palace and government offices, where officials had been following the proceedings with close attention and considerable investment in a particular outcome, confusion and anger were beginning to brew. In a secure meeting room, several ministers gathered, their faces reflecting varying degrees of shock and fury. The carefully constructed plan had collapsed. Traoré had not been arrested. The judge had not followed the script that had been so carefully prepared, despite the considerable incentives that had been offered. How did this happen? One minister demanded, his voice sharp with frustration. "We had everything arranged. The judge was supposed to have been amenable to our position. The security personnel were ready. Every detail was planned." What went wrong? A senior official, older and perhaps wiser than his colleagues, responded in a voice barely above a whisper. "Some things cannot be bought, gentlemen. Some moments cannot be scripted. They write themselves into history, and no amount of planning or money can redirect them." The room fell into uncomfortable silence as the implications of his words sank in. They had underestimated not just Traoré, but the very idea he represented. They had assumed that sufficient application of political pressure, legal maneuvering, and, if necessary, intimidation would suffice to neutralize him. They had failed to account for the possibility that justice might actually assert itself, or that a judge might place principle above personal benefit. One younger official, who had been silent until now, spoke hesitantly. "The social media response has been overwhelming. The photograph of Traoré leaving the courthouse has been shared more than any single post in our country's history. The hashtags calling him a hero of the people are trending not just here, but across the continent. Another minister waved dismissively. Social media sentiment means nothing. It will pass. Something else will capture people's attention next week. But the older official shook his head slowly. You're wrong. This is different. This isn't about trending topics or temporary enthusiasm. What happened today struck a chord because it touched on something fundamental. People's desire to believe that justice can prevail over corruption, that one person standing firm can make a difference. You can't simply wait for that sentiment to pass. It will grow, and grow it did. Within hours, the story had been picked up by international media outlets. Al Jazeera ran a segment titled Unprecedented Defiance of Political Manipulation in West African Court. The BBC featured analysis by experts on African politics, many of whom noted that the incident reflected growing dissatisfaction with foreign interference in the continent's affairs. The New York Times ran an op-ed calling it a silent revolutionary moment. CNN's coverage included interview segments with human rights advocates who praised both Traoré's composure and Judge Kabiori's courage. The United Nations Human Rights Office, while not issuing an official statement, let it be known through unofficial channels that the proceedings were being monitored with interest, and that the preservation of judicial independence was being viewed as a positive development worthy of note. The impact of that day's events extended into an unexpected quarter: the military itself. The soldiers who had been stationed in the courtroom, standing at attention along the walls with rifles at ready and expressions of professional neutrality, had witnessed everything. They had seen Traoré enter with dignity, endure accusations with composure, and leave without having bent or broken. More significantly, they had seen Judge Kabiori stand up to pressure and prevent an arrest that would have been legally questionable at best. They had observed the two plainclothes officers retreat, in shame after being called out for attempting to execute what amounted to a predetermined political decision masquerading as law. Enforcement, for soldiers trained since their first day of service to follow orders without question, to never allow personal feelings to interfere with duty. This experience created profound cognitive dissonance. The military doctrine that had been drilled into them emphasized unthinking obedience. Your job is not to think. Your duty is to obey. But what they had witnessed raised uncomfortable questions. What happens when orders serve injustice? What is a soldier's duty when the uniform is used to oppress rather than protect? That evening, when they returned to their barracks, an unusual quiet prevailed. Some men changed out of their uniforms in thoughtful silence. Others sat on their bunks, staring at nothing in particular, lost in contemplation. The usual banter and rough camaraderie were absent, replaced by an introspective mood that none of them could quite articulate. A young private, barely 25 years old, approached his sergeant as they prepared for evening roll call. "Sir," he asked quietly, his voice hesitant, "was Captain Traoré actually breaking the law?" The sergeant, a veteran with 15 years of service, paused before responding. He chose his words carefully. "There's a difference, son, between law and justice. Sometimes they align perfectly. Sometimes they don't. Today we saw that difference. That's all I'll say." But it was enough. That night, several soldiers in different barracks across the capital did something that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. They began discussing politics, questioning orders, and wondering aloud whether their service was being used for purposes they could not in good conscience support. Some went so far as to pin small pieces of paper inside their lockers or on their uniforms where only they could see them. The messages varied, but the sentiment was consistent. We stand for law, not for power. Justice over orders. Duty to people, not to politicians. This was not organized resistance or planned rebellion. It was something potentially more significant. The first stirrings of conscience within an institution that had long prided itself on operating without sentiment or moral questioning. And when conscience awakens within a military force, governments have reason to be concerned, for the foundation of their power becomes uncertain. In private WhatsApp groups and encrypted messaging channels used by soldiers, discussion threads that would have been unthinkable previously began to appear. Someone posted a photograph of Traoré leaving the courthouse. Beneath it, a caption: "If he could stand alone, whose servants are we?" Military intelligence officers monitoring these communications prepared reports for their superiors. The reports were careful and measured in tone, but their essential message was clear and troubling. Lower ranks showing signs of divided loyalties. The Traoré situation has created ideological uncertainty within the ranks. Senior military officials read these reports with growing unease. Some called emergency meetings with their intelligence chiefs, demanding more detailed analysis. They wanted to know how deep this sentiment ran, whether it represented a genuine threat to command structure, and most importantly, whether their soldiers could still be counted on to follow orders without question. If those orders involved actions against Traoré or his supporters, the answers they received were not comforting. One particularly candid colonel told his commanding general, "Sir, if we order troops to move against Traoré now, I cannot guarantee they will comply. We may face refusals or worse, defections. The man has become a symbol. Symbols are more dangerous than any armed insurgent, because you cannot kill an idea with bullets." Meanwhile, the two plainclothes officers who had attempted to arrest Traoré in the courtroom found themselves in an awkward position. They had followed orders, done exactly what they had been instructed to do, yet they had been publicly rebuked and humiliated. Worse, they were beginning to question their own actions. One of them, a man named Amadou, who had served in security forces for 12 years, sat in his small apartment that night, unable to sleep. His wife noticed his distress and asked what troubled him. "I almost arrested a good man today," he said quietly. "Not a criminal, not a terrorist. Just a man who speaks for people like us. And I was going to put him in chains because someone with power told me to." His wife was silent for a long moment, then placed her hand on his shoulder. "But you didn't," she said. "The judge stopped you. Maybe that was meant to happen. Maybe that was your chance to see clearly." Amadou nodded slowly, but the shame remained. He knew he would have gone through with the arrest if Judge Kabiyori hadn't intervened. He had been prepared to be the instrument of injustice, and only external intervention had prevented it. That realization ate at him. The next day, he requested a meeting with his supervisor and asked to be reassigned to different duties. "I cannot in good conscience continue in this role," he explained. "I need to serve the law, not political convenience." His request was denied, but the conversation itself was noted and reported upward through the chain of command. The cracks in the system were showing. While the nation celebrated what had happened in the courtroom, Judge Said Usman Kabiyori sat alone in his chambers, contemplating the consequences of his actions. He had known, even as he spoke those defiant words, that there would be a price to pay. Men of integrity understand this fundamental truth. Standing for principle often requires personal sacrifice. The price came sooner than expected. The very next morning, an official envelope arrived on his desk, delivered by a stone-faced clerk who would not meet his eyes. The envelope bore the seal of the Ministry of Justice. Inside was a terse notification. Judge Kabiyori was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending an investigation into procedural irregularities in his handling of the Traoré case. The language was bureaucratic and carefully neutral, but the message was unmistakable. Retribution. Judge Kabiyori read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer. He felt no surprise, no anger, only a deep sense of confirmation. He had made his choice with full awareness of likely consequences. Some decisions are made not for career advancement or personal security, but for the soul's peace. This had been one of those decisions. News of the judge's suspension spread rapidly, triggering immediate public reaction. Within hours, social media erupted with outrage. Hashtags demanding his reinstatement began trending. Legal scholars and human rights organizations issued statements condemning what they characterized as political interference in judicial independence. Outside the courthouse, people began gathering spontaneously. They brought white roses, the traditional symbol of justice in Burkina Faso, and laid them on the courthouse steps. With each flower came a handwritten note. "Thank you for showing us that courts can still serve justice. You saved our faith in the system. A true judge stands for law, not power." A retired law professor, a man who had taught constitutional law for 35 years, came to the courthouse and spoke to the gathered crowd. "Cabiori's name will be taught in our law schools for generations, not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of what judicial courage looks like. He chose principle over position, and in doing so, he honored his oath more than those who condemned him ever have." The international legal community took notice as well. The International Bar Association issued a statement expressing concern about the suspension and calling for Judge Cabiori's immediate reinstatement. Human rights organizations from across Africa and Europe sent letters of support. A coalition of legal groups offered to cover any expenses if he chose to challenge the suspension through legal channels. That evening, Judge Cabiori stood before his mirror, removing his judicial robes for what might be the last time. He looked at his reflection, an older man now, with gray threading his hair and lines marking his face, and asked himself the question that every person who makes a costly moral choice must confront: did I do the right thing? From somewhere deep within, the answer came clearly. If courts do not remain true to their purpose, where else can people turn for justice? He was alone now, stripped of official protection, unsupported by the institutions he had served faithfully for decades. But his solitude was not that of defeat. It was the solitude of moral clarity, of conscience at peace. Late that night, there came a knock at his door. Opening it, he found a young man, perhaps 19 or 20 years old, standing on his doorstep with an envelope in his hands. "Sir," the young man said, his voice trembling with emotion, "my father sent me with this letter. He said to tell you that you reminded us that judges are not merely people who wear robes. A true judge is someone who can stand between opposing forces and speak truth, regardless of consequences." Judge Cabiori accepted the letter, opened it, and read the simple message inside. "You may lose your position, but you have gained something more valuable. The respect of those who still believe justice matters. We will not forget what you did." He carefully folded the letter and placed it in the legal text on his shelf, the same volume where he recorded important cases. But this would be the most important entry, not a legal precedent, but a reminder that the law serves a purpose beyond itself. In the days following the courtroom drama, something remarkable began happening across Burkina Faso. What started as isolated expressions of support for Traoré and Judge Cabiori evolved into a broader movement, not organized or led by any particular group, but organic and unstoppable. In university lecture halls, students began questioning their professors about constitutional law, judicial independence, and the relationship between political power and legal authority, philosophy and political science. Classes became forums for passionate debate about the nature of justice and the responsibilities of citizens when their government strays from principle. One particularly influential moment came when a law student stood up during a lecture and asked her professor, "If we are training to become officers of the court, what should we do when the court itself becomes corrupted? Do we serve the institution or the principles it was meant to embody?" The professor, a cautious man who had learned to avoid controversial topics, paused for a long moment before responding. "That question," he finally said, "is perhaps the most important one a lawyer can ask, and the answer you choose will define not just your career, but your character." In marketplaces and tea shops, where ordinary citizens gathered to discuss the news of the day, Traoré's name was invoked repeatedly as an example of the kind of leadership people were hungry for, leadership that spoke truth, that refused to be bought or intimidated, that stood with the poor against the powerful. A taxi driver in Ouagadougou told his passengers, "For years, we've been told we must accept things as they are, that ordinary people cannot challenge those in power. Traoré showed us that's a lie. One person, standing alone with only truth as a weapon, can make the mighty tremble." Artists and musicians began incorporating the courtroom incident into their work. A popular rapper released a song titled "The Day Justice Spoke," which became an instant hit. The lyrics captured the moment when Judge Kabiori stopped the arrest. They came with chains to bind the truth, but justice rose and said, "Not here, not now." One voice can silence 1,000 lies. One stand can shake the foundations of power. The song was played at gatherings, weddings, and community events. Young people memorized the lyrics and sang them as anthems of resistance and hope. A prominent playwright began work on a dramatic interpretation of the courtroom scene. His play, tentatively titled The Verdict of Conscience, would attempt to capture not just the events, but their deeper meaning, the eternal struggle between power and principle, between expedience and ethics. In rural villages far from the capital, where access to internet and social media was limited, the story spread through traditional means. Storytellers recounting the tale around evening fires, elders discussing it after Friday prayers, mothers teaching it to their children as a moral lesson. An old farmer in the countryside told his grandchildren, "Remember this story. Remember that when that soldier stood alone in that courtroom, he was not thinking about himself. He was thinking about you, about your future, about what kind of country you would inherit. That is what true courage looks like." The story of what happened in that Ouagadougou courtroom resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Across Africa, in nations where similar struggles between entrenched power and popular will were unfolding, Traoré's stand became a reference point and inspiration. In Mali, where military and civilian authority had been in tension for years, student activists organized peaceful demonstrations carrying signs that read, "We are all Traoré." In Niger, civil society organizations cited the Burkina Faso case in their advocacy for judicial reform and independence. In Chad, where authoritarian rule had long been the norm, underground pro-democracy groups distributed the photograph of Traoré leaving the courthouse as a symbol of resistance. Western media coverage varied in tone and emphasis. Some outlets framed it primarily as a dramatic individual story, one man against a corrupt system. Others provided broader context about the complex interplay of domestic politics, foreign influence, and popular movements across the Sahel region. A correspondent for Le Monde wrote, "What we witnessed in Ouagadougou was not merely a courtroom drama, but a crystallization of tensions that have been building across West Africa for years. The era when leaders could assume their populations would passively accept governance that serves external interests rather than local needs is ending. Traoré is a symptom of that change, not its cause." The Guardian published an editorial arguing that Western nations should take note. For too long, democratic nations have supported undemocratic practices in Africa when those practices served Western interests. The Traoré case reminds us that African people, like people everywhere, hunger for justice, accountability, and leadership that serves them rather than foreign powers or domestic elites. Not all international reaction was positive, of course. Some foreign policy establishments viewed Traoré's popularity with concern. In diplomatic cables later leaked to the press, one Western embassy characterized him as a populist, demagogue whose appeal to nationalist sentiment could destabilize the region. Another cable warned that the lionization of Traoré sets a dangerous precedent, potentially encouraging military personnel in other countries to intervene in political matters. These diplomatic concerns reflected a fundamental tension. The democratic values that Western nations professed to champion were sometimes in conflict with the stability and compliant leadership they preferred in practice. Traoré represented a challenge to that comfortable arrangement. Chinese state media covered the story with particular interest, framing it as evidence that African nations were increasingly resistant to Western neo-colonial practices. Russia's international outlets emphasized similar themes, presenting Traoré as part of a broader pattern of African nations asserting sovereignty against external pressure. The real significance, however, transcended geopolitical positioning by various powers. What mattered most was how ordinary African people, from Cape Town to Cairo, from Dakar to Nairobi, responded to the story. They saw in it a reflection of their own struggles and aspirations. They saw proof that resistance was possible, that dignity could prevail over intimidation, that truth spoken courageously could not be entirely suppressed. In the weeks following the courtroom confrontation, several significant developments unfolded. The government, reading the public mood and international attention correctly, quietly dropped most of the charges against Traoré. An official statement, carefully worded to avoid appearing as a surrender, announced that, upon review, insufficient evidence exists to proceed with prosecution at this time. No one was fooled by this formulation. Everyone understood it as a strategic retreat in the face of overwhelming public support for Traoré and the embarrassment of the failed arrest attempt. The government was choosing to back down rather than risk further confrontation that might spiral beyond their control. Traoré himself maintained a relatively low profile in the immediate aftermath. He did not give triumphant press conferences or embark on victory tours. Instead, he returned to his work and his community, allowing his actions in the courtroom to speak for themselves. This restraint only enhanced his reputation. People respected that he had not sought to capitalize on the moment for personal aggrandizement. When he did speak publicly, in a brief statement released through a local journalist he trusted, his words were measured. What happened in that courtroom was not about me. It was about the principle that law must serve justice, and that courts must remain independent of political manipulation. Judge Traoré deserves the credit for upholding those principles. I simply stood for truth, as any citizen should. This deflection of praise to Judge Traoré was noted and appreciated. It showed that Traoré understood the larger significance of what had occurred, that it was about institutional integrity rather than personal vindication. The campaign for Judge Traoré's reinstatement gained momentum. Legal organizations filed formal challenges to his suspension. Bar associations voted overwhelmingly to support him. International pressure mounted. Eventually, facing an untenable situation, the Ministry of Justice announced that the investigation had been satisfactorily concluded and that Judge Traoré would be returning to his duties. It was not a full exoneration or apology, but it was recognition that removing him had become politically impossible. When he returned to the courthouse for the first time after his reinstatement, hundreds of people lined the streets to welcome him. They held signs thanking him for his courage and threw flower petals in his path, a traditional gesture of respect and honor. Judge Traoré, characteristically, said little about his ordeal. In a brief statement to the press, he simply noted, "I did what my oath required." Any judge worthy of the position would have done the same. The law is meant to protect the powerless from the powerful, not to serve as a tool of oppression. That principle can never be compromised, regardless of pressure or consequence. The story's impact extended beyond individual vindication or immediate political outcomes. It sparked broader conversations about governance, justice, and the relationship between military and civilian authority across West Africa. In military academies and training centers throughout the region, the case became a subject of study and debate. Military instructors found themselves fielding questions from cadets about when orders should be questioned, about the difference between discipline and blind obedience, about the proper role of armed forces in society. These were not comfortable discussions for many senior officers, who had been trained in an era when such questions were considered subversive. But they were necessary discussions, reflecting a generational shift in how young soldiers viewed their responsibilities. One particularly progressive, colonel at a military academy in Ghana, incorporated the Traoré case into his curriculum on military ethics. Young officers, he told his students, must understand that the uniform comes with moral responsibilities that transcend following orders. You serve your nation, which means you serve its people and its constitution. When those who give you orders violate that constitution or betray the people's trust, you face the most difficult decision of your career. The Traoré case illustrates one way to navigate that dilemma, standing firm for principle while respecting institutional processes. Civil society organizations across the region used the case as a focal point for advocacy campaigns. They organized public forums on judicial independence, corruption, and accountability. They created educational materials explaining citizens' rights and the importance of institutional integrity. They trained community leaders to recognize and resist attempts to manipulate legal systems for political purposes. In Senegal, A coalition of NGOs launched a Courts for the People campaign explicitly inspired by Judge Kabiore's actions. The campaign aimed to monitor judicial proceedings, document cases where political pressure appeared to influence outcomes, and support judges who demonstrated independence. In Ghana, activists pushing for stronger anti-corruption measures frequently cited the Burkina Faso case as evidence that change was possible when people demanded it. If Burkina people could force their government to back down from prosecuting Traoré, they argued, then we can force our government to take corruption seriously. Even in nations with relatively stable democratic institutions, the story resonated. It reminded people that democracy is not a fixed state but a constant struggle, that rights and freedoms must be defended in each generation, that the price of liberty truly is eternal vigilance. As months passed, the courtroom confrontation between power and principle evolved from current events into cultural touchstone. Artists across media, visual, literary, musical, theatrical, found in it a rich source of inspiration and meaning. Prominent Burkina sculptor created a piece titled The Moment, depicting Judge Kabiore with his hand raised in the gesture that stopped the arrest. The sculpture, installed in a public square in Ouagadougou, became a gathering place for civic events and peaceful protests. People would place flowers at its base on the anniversary of the courtroom incident, treating it almost as a shrine to the idea that justice can prevail. Novelists began incorporating fictionalized versions of the event into their works. One particularly successful novel, The Silent Stand, used the incident as the climax of a sweeping narrative about 3 generations of a Burkina family navigating the nation's turbulent political history. The book became a bestseller across French-speaking Africa and was eventually translated into multiple languages. Filmmakers approached Traoré about producing a biographical film. He declined to participate, saying he did not want the focus to be on him personally. "If you want to make a film," he told one persistent director, "make it about the people's struggle for justice, not about one soldier. Make it about what happened in that courtroom as an example of what's possible when ordinary citizens refuse to accept injustice." The director took this advice to heart and produced a film titled The People's Court that focused not on Traoré but on a fictional composite character, an everyday citizen, navigating a corrupt legal system. The courtroom scene was included but was framed as one example among many of people standing up for their rights. The film won several awards at African film festivals and sparked discussions about judicial reform wherever it was shown. In academic circles, scholars began examining the incident from various perspectives. Sociologists analyzed it as an example of how individual actions can catalyze broader social movements. Political scientists studied it as a case of successful resistance to authoritarian practices. Legal scholars debated its implications for understanding judicial independence in contexts where formal institutional protections are weak. A doctoral dissertation titled Dignity as Resistance: The Traoré Case and the Politics of Moral Authority in Contemporary Africa argued that the incident represented a new form of political activism, one that relied not on traditional organizing or violent resistance, but on the power of moral clarity and personal integrity to inspire and mobilize. The dissertation's author conducted extensive interviews with people who had been present in the courtroom or witnessed events unfold outside. One recurring theme in these testimonies was the profound emotional impact of the moment. People described feeling as though they were witnessing something sacred, a moment when the gap between how things were and how they should be suddenly narrowed. A journalist who had been there wrote in her memoir, "I have covered wars, elections, natural disasters, and historic summits. I have seen violence and celebrated peace agreements. But I have never been in a space that felt so charged with meaning as that courtroom did when Judge Kabiore raised his hand and said, 'This is a court, not a battlefield.' In that moment, I understood what people mean when they talk about the power of truth. It's not abstract or metaphorical. It's as real and tangible as any physical force." Beyond the public and political dimensions, the courtroom drama triggered countless personal transformations. individual moments of clarity and decision that collectively reshaped society in subtle but significant ways. The young private who had questioned his sergeant about whether Traoré was actually breaking the law eventually left military service. He enrolled in law school, determined to become an advocate for justice. In his application essay, he wrote, "I witnessed a moment when courage prevailed over cowardice, when truth spoke louder than power. I want to dedicate my life to creating more such moments." One of the journalists who had covered the trial, a woman who had become somewhat cynical after years of reporting on corruption and injustice, found her faith in journalism renewed. She started an independent media outlet focused specifically on covering judicial proceedings and holding courts accountable. "If we don't bear witness," she wrote in her founding editorial, "if we don't document both the failures and the triumphs of our legal system, then those who would corrupt it face no consequences." Traoré and Judge Kabiori showed me that individual integrity matters. Journalism must be part of defending that integrity. A government official who had been peripherally involved in planning the prosecution of Traoré quietly resigned from his position. He took a significant pay cut to work for an anti-corruption NGO, telling his surprised family, "I cannot continue to be part of a system that punishes honesty and rewards manipulation. What happened in that courtroom showed me what I had become. I need to become something better." A university student who had been politically apathetic, focused only on her studies and future career prospects, became an activist after watching footage of the courtroom scene. "I realized that my apathy was a form of complicity," she explained. "If people like Traoré and Judge Kabiori are willing to risk everything to stand for principle, the least I can do is use my voice and my education to support them." These individual transformations, multiplied across thousands of people, created a cultural shift. There emerged a generation of young Burkinabés who measured their choices and careers against the standards set that day in the courtroom. The question, "What would I have done in Traoré's place?" or "Would I have had Judge Kabiori's courage?" became a litmus test for evaluating one's own integrity. Years later, historians and social commentators attempting to trace the evolution of West African politics in the early 21st century would point to the Traoré courtroom incident as a pivotal moment, not because it changed everything overnight, but because it revealed and accelerated changes already underway. The incident occurred at a unique historical juncture. Across Africa, a generation was coming of age that had not experienced colonial rule directly, but had grown up watching their nation's independence promises remain unfulfilled. They had seen wealth extracted, leaders corrupted, and foreign powers continuing to exert influence through economic leverage and political manipulation. This generation was increasingly unwilling to accept the narrative that such conditions were inevitable or acceptable. They were connected through social media and mobile technology in ways their parents had not been, able to organize, communicate, and share information rapidly across borders. They were educated, aware of global standards for governance and human rights, and determined to demand better from their own leaders. Traoré embodied this generational shift. He was not an old revolutionary clinging to outdated ideologies. He was a young military officer who had sworn an oath to protect his nation and took that oath seriously, perhaps more seriously than those who had administered it expected. He represented competence, integrity, and a refusal to accept corruption as normal. Judge Kabiori, though older, represented complementary values: institutional integrity, professional excellence, and the courage to uphold principle despite pressure. Together, their actions in that courtroom became a reference point, a demonstration that resistance was possible and could succeed. Political scientists debated whether the incident should be classified as part of the African Spring, a series of pro-democracy movements across the continent, or whether it represented something distinct. Some argued it was more significant, precisely because it did not involve mass protests or violence, but rather achieved its impact through moral authority and institutional courage. What makes the Traoré case so important, one prominent scholar wrote, is that it demonstrated a pathway to change that does not require overthrowing systems, but rather demands that systems live up to their stated principles. This is potentially more sustainable than revolutionary change, because it works with institutional frameworks rather than trying to destroy and rebuild them. Others countered that this analysis was too optimistic, that one incident, however inspiring, could not overcome structural problems built into political and economic systems over decades or centuries. We cannot mistake a moment of victory for systemic change, one critic argued. Traoré and Judge Kabiyori won a battle, but the war for genuine justice and accountable governance continues. Both perspectives contain truth. The courtroom incident did not magically transform Burkina Faso into a perfectly governed nation. Corruption continued, foreign interference persisted, poverty remained widespread. But something had shifted in the collective consciousness. People had seen that resistance was possible, that truth spoken courageously could not be entirely suppressed, that ordinary individuals making principled choices could matter. In the end, what happened in that Ouagadougou courtroom transcended the specifics of charges and countercharges, of individual protagonists and political machinations. It became a story that people told themselves, about who they were and who they aspired to be. The photograph of Captain Ibrahim Traoré walking out of the courthouse, head held high, became one of the iconic images of early 21st century Africa. It hung in homes and offices, was printed on T-shirts and posters, appeared in textbooks and documentaries. But it was more than just a powerful image. It was a reminder. It reminded people that dignity is a choice, not a condition, that standing for truth requires courage, but offers rewards that material comfort cannot match, that institutions are only as strong as the individuals who comprise them. That justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied if people remain vigilant and committed. Years later, when asked about that day, Traoré would say simply, "I did what any citizen should do. I told the truth and refused to be intimidated." The remarkable thing is not that I did this. The remarkable thing is how surprised people were that someone would do it. That shows how far we had fallen. That simple integrity seemed heroic. Judge Kabiyori, in his final years before retirement, reflected on the incident in an interview. "I took an oath when I became a judge. That oath did not include exceptions for when honoring it became inconvenient or dangerous. I simply kept my oath. The fact that this seemed extraordinary reveals how normalized the violation of oaths had become. My hope is that the next generation of judges will find it entirely ordinary to uphold the law without fear or favor." The story of that day in the courtroom became part of the shared cultural heritage not just of Burkina Faso but of Africa more broadly. It was told and retold, each telling emphasizing different aspects, each listener finding personal meaning in the narrative. For some, it was a story about courage, the courage to stand alone against overwhelming power. For others, it was about integrity, maintaining personal principles despite pressure and temptation. For still others, it was about the power of institutions, how courts and laws, when properly honored, can protect the vulnerable from the powerful. Perhaps most fundamentally, it was a story about dignity. In a world that often seems to demand that people compromise their values, subordinate their principles to expediency, and accept injustice as inevitable, Captain Traoré and Judge Kabiyori demonstrated that another path exists. They showed that dignity, refusing to be diminished, maintaining self-respect, standing for truth, is both possible and powerful. The day that dignity stood unshaken in a courtroom in Ouagadougou became a touchstone, a reference point, a source of inspiration and instruction. It reminded people across Africa and beyond that change begins not with grand gestures or violent upheaval, but with individuals choosing, in specific moments, to do what is right rather than what is convenient. And in that reminder lay seeds of transformation that continue to grow, nurture new movements, inspire new generations, and gradually reshape the landscape of possibility. The story is not over. It continues in every person who hears it and decides to stand a little taller, speak a little more truthfully, demand a little more justice. That ultimately is the legacy of what happened that day. Not a finished achievement, but an ongoing invitation. An invitation to dignity, to courage, to integrity, to the belief that individuals matter and that truth, however difficult to speak, is always worth defending.